So we left off with the chimpanzees and the bonobos, and we start off this part with the Hicklika, which is the human chimp last common ancestor. I like the way they say it better on the chart, where they would say the hominin chimp bonobo, maybe last common ancestor. Because from this ancestor, let's just say around 9 million years ago, comes up creatures that become habitually bipedal. Bipedal primates that we know as hominins that would eventually lead to something we're going to call humans. But where you draw a line between the humans and other hominin lines has always been very debated. And the other ancestor, last common ancestor that we have back there is also diverged into what would become the chimpanzees and bonobos, and then there was a further divergence as we learned at about 1 million years ago between these two species, even though they probably look more alike to us than we would look to them. So we have the human hominid chimp last common ancestor coming in at about 6 to 9 million years ago. A pretty wide range. That is mostly based on what we call the molecular clock method, going back and trying to genetically trace the number of mutations that probably happened and get us a time estimate. Because the truth of the matter is, there are just not a lot of fossil evidence from this time period. We get better fossil evidence as we go along in some cases, but the stuff from this time period is very sketchy. And how would you know? How would you know that you were dealing with the last common ancestor of a fossil? You dug one up. The problem here is, which one would it be? This is exactly the time of a gradual divergence between these lines. And when I say gradual divergence, it might take 1 million years. Species, they don't just turn into turn into other things overnight and then they can't reproduce. They might split off for a while. Some of them would become more habitually bipedal, but then they might get back together and hybridize after a little bit. We think that somehow how evolution works sometimes is that creatures at different rates of development, you might say, then get back together, and those hybridizations cause more dramatic changes in the genetic code. So it's difficult to say how we would know if we were dealing with an ape or a hominin at this time, because they are going to be the creatures that gave way to both. Our current estimation of what the human origins tree looks like is a very branchy thing with a lot of offshoots and people going off in different directions and a lot of stuff that we just don't know. It's a very complicated story. It's a bushy, many branches kind of story, and there's a lot of mysteries around here. Now, you might wonder why there are so many mysteries in the story of human origins, and part of it has to do with how fragmentary the fossil record is. Most of the fossil record doesn't exist because when you're alive, when you are any creature that is being alive, the last thing you want to do is turn into a fossil, because that means you've been trapped somewhere and now you're going to be dead and you're going to be preserved. And if you're one of a soft-bodied creature walking around, maybe an ape or hominin or something like that, and you happen to die, what is probably going to happen to you? Yeah, you're going to be eaten by vultures and other predators. So most creatures are trying not to be fossils, and if they do die, they're not ever going to become fossils. They're going to be eaten. So we have a very fragmentary fossil record. There are certain regions that produce a lot of fossils, or I would say a comparatively large amount of fossils. So a lot of what we know is from this region of East Africa. But even in this part of the East Africa where you have a decent amount of fossils, there are long periods of time where you don't have any fossil evidence. And we know there was lots of stuff going on in the middle of Africa, and some of the first Homo sapien fossils come from this area of Morocco. So there's a lot going on evolutionarily speaking throughout the continent of Africa, and we just don't know because those regions were not productive in terms of fossils. As we've heard and as we've studied, the teeth are what best preserve. A lot of times you're going to have to get evidence from the teeth of a creature, and in some cases you're just dealing with a single tooth and you're trying to estimate what is happening. So it's very difficult to date these remains if you're only dealing with one little tooth. And it's also very difficult. One of the reasons there's so many debates about when a new species forms is to try and determine what the species are from the fossils themselves. So, the biological definition of being a species. Remember, that doesn't just mean change from your ancestors, that means you can reproduce with each other, and you can then go on to have those children reproduce with each other. Now, that's one thing when we observe it in the present. And we've discovered, for example, in the present that some things that we thought were species, you can get them together and they can reproduce successfully. So in zoos, we can cross lions and tigers and come up with ligers. And I think they can reproduce with each other. So in the world, when we look out at creatures today, we might try to figure out what is a living species, but we don't know. Now try to think about doing that when you have bones. How do you know that these two sets of bones can reproduce with each other? You have no idea. So you're trying to estimate based on how different these bones or fossils are from each other. Fortunately, we have a little bit more information now that we've been able to get DNA and sequence a lot of ancient DNA. But oftentimes that's made the picture even messier, even more complex than we thought before. I mentioned that we think that now a lot of the evolution or a lot of evolutionary change can come when two creatures which seem to be speciating, seem to be developing into two different species, come back together and create some new funky stuff, maybe large scale modifications. So there have been a lot of debates about this. It's led to two kinds of people, I would say, in the fossil record. They're the people who every time there's a new fossil discovery or new bone discovery, they think it's a new species. And those people are called the splitters. They will say that, oh, here we have a Homo habilis, we have a new species of human beings because of this bone. And another person will come along and they'll say, nah, that's just what we already knew. That's just a variation within a species. Those people are known as the lumpers because they tend to lump things together and think it's all one species. I want to talk about what we used to think and what we used to look for in evolution. You may have heard this term, the missing link. People used to spend a lot of time believing, in part because we didn't know as much about genetics, but in part just because based on old ideas, biblically based ideas on the idea of a great chain of being. If there are all these creatures on an ascending chain of being, we're always looking for the links between them. And this idea has stuck with us for a long time. Since we didn't have a lot of evidence, people imagined that there were very straight lines from one creature to another. Chimpanzees or chimpanzee-like creatures were gradually and slowly ascending along the line to human beings. What we're looking for, we thought differentiated the humans from the chimpanzees was our big brains. Now, these ideas led to scientists being vulnerable to hoaxes. You may have heard of the Piltdown man, which was when somebody put a chimpanzee jaw together with a more modern human brain and said that they discovered the missing link. And because people were primed for this idea that there were missing links and that there were big brains on chimpanzee jaws because big brains are cool, that became accepted even though it was just a hoax. We also believed, or we also thought that you had your biological development first, that you always had to have the biological stuff in place, and then you added on the cultural stuff, the learning, the tools. That we got all the smarts first, and then we built things with it. So, what do we think now? What we think now is we are not looking for missing links. Sometimes people use the phrase missing link, but what they are really looking for is a common ancestor. And that common ancestor may not look like either of the existing stuff in the present. So, as we mentioned, chimpanzees have also been evolving. Bonobos have also been evolving. They aren't going to look like what looked 6, 7 million years ago. Most people think that that last common ancestor probably looked more like something between a gorilla and a chimpanzee. Again, the gorillas had split off, but that's what people think it looked like. So all these things are evolving. There is not going to be some gradual missing link between each one. Because we've learned that evolution is a lot bushier than the straight line model. Creatures go off and do things, and then they go extinct and they don't do too much. They might have a very good run. Species might last for 1 million years. Not bad. But they aren't around today. A lot of the human hominin ancestors that we find have what they call a mosaic of traits. They're not necessarily going to be all packaged together at once. So later on, we'll talk about Homo naledi, a very famous find from South Africa. They seem to have very sophisticated wrist and arm bones, but very small skull cases. They don't really fit the pattern, or now we know that there wasn't a pattern because different creatures will develop different traits at different times. There's not one way everything is going. We also now know that it was bipedalism or walking that came first. The first thing that distinguishes hominins from other primates is the walking part, the bipedal primate part. We don't really see big brains come in or even bigger brains for about 4 million years. Maybe some variation in brain size. So when we look back at most of the history of the bipedal primates, our ancestors, they start standing up and walking around first. We don't see brain development, at least in terms of brain size and complexity, until a lot later than the bipedalism comes in. Fitting with our ideas about the biocultural aspects of human beings, cultural learning goes way back in the hominin line. We have been co-evolving with culture and tools since the beginning. The transformations that we see are not culture being added on to biology. What we see is culture transforming our learned behavior, transforming our development biology as we go along. So that's what we think now. That's what we're looking for. It may change a little. We are always tweaking our models, but it's good to get ourselves out of some of these older ideas that led us down some dead ends and made people vulnerable to getting faked out by chimpanzee jaws. So, as our textbook describes and was just talked about, it's walking or bipedalism that evolves first at about 7 million years ago, 6 to 8 million years ago, around then. And this is a gradual process, as we'll see. This is not you just stand up and you're walking around. We used to not think so. We used to think you just we had these hunters striding out onto the grasslands of Africa, looking over the grasslands with a spear ready to hunt something down. But if you think about it, makes very little sense because you have these 3 feet tall, maybe 4 feet tall creatures about the size of little kindergartners strolling out onto the African savanna, popping their heads up to look out over the countryside. What's the first thing that's going to happen? Get whacked off by a lion. Yeah, that's just hilarious. The technical term for walking or being and strolling around on 2 feet. We used to think that the African savanna had become all grassland, so that creatures were adapting to the savanna. What we know now is that it was still a lot of forest environment, but the forest was becoming fragmented. There were more open areas. The primates had to cross more land and adapt to more varied terrain than simply life in the trees. So this is a possibility for getting around to different places. Bipedalism, or being able to walk, also frees your hands so you can carry things if you're moving around, can carry babies, maybe start doing more tool use. It can help you with thermoregulation. So if you're in a hot sun environment, you're on all fours, your back is exposed to a lot more sun than if you're standing up, get some cooling wind currents and not as much sun. There's also an intriguing hypothesis or idea about this, is that although being bipedal, you can't run as fast as other creatures. We see in the Olympics that people are pretty fast. They're not as fast as those lions, tigers, and cheetahs and all the predators, but we can, over distances, outwalk many creatures. If you're trying to move a lot during a day, it is more efficient, or you use less energy if you're walking over long distances to do it bipedally than on all fours. We may not get the same bursts of speed as even dogs or cats, but we can usually outwalk some of these animals. Even horses, you can often outwalk them if you really want to. Later on, this may have translated into endurance running. Humans and some of our hominin ancestors like Homo erectus seem to be some of the only primates that can run long distances. And because of our being able to sweat and being bipedal, we can run a lot further than any other primate. Some people believe that this was very important for some of the early forms of hunting. So humans were not the best at predation, but they could outwalk or outrun and eventually run down some of these animals that can't sweat. A very fit human being can run down antelope over time. I would say that all of these ideas are potentially important, but none of them has been proved. There might have been multiple possible advantages to being bipedal. There's also some big disadvantages too. You lose some things and you get a lot of back pain later in your life from being bipedal. It makes it hard. So this is probably a gradual development, as we see with one of the fossil finds that we call Ardi. Short for Ardipithecus ramidus, lives about 4.8 to 4.4 million years ago. And this is really an incredible find because unlike other finds, you get more than just teeth. You get, look at all those little pieces, which had to be reassembled. You get about 60% of this creature. Now, this creature seems to be somewhere between the last common ancestor, the more ape-like primates, and creatures who are much more habitually bipedal. You'll notice that Ardi has an opposable toe as well as an opposable thumb. They seem to be bipedal sometimes, but differently bipedal. It's been hypothesized that in some ways, maybe these creatures were walking bipedally in the trees. So pulling up and walking along, but in the trees as well. This has been a very intriguing and great find. And some people insist that this must be part of the main line of hominins leading us along to where we are today. Other people are not as convinced. They think this is maybe some branch of creatures that went off and was a sample of bipedalism back in the day, but doesn't contribute to the now. So it takes a while before we get serious evidence of habitual bipedalism. The best evidence we have are the Australopithecines or Australopithecus. Don't be confused by that first, by how that are named. Australo means southern and Pithecus means ape. So literally means southern ape. All of these finds are coming from Africa. These ones mostly from what is now Ethiopia. The most famous example of these are the Australopithecus afarensis from 3.9 to 3.3 million years ago. And the very most famous of these is a skeleton called Lucy, which was first found in the 1970s. It was named Lucy apparently because at the time they were listening to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles, decided to call the skeleton Lucy when they stumbled across it. It has later been renamed Dinknesh, which is an Ethiopian name for "you are marvelous." And as we will see, a lot of the things that were taken away from their homeland in Africa have been, in some ways, hopefully, some of them have been restored to give them their proper names. We see some of these creatures, or we see evidence for bipedalism in the famous Laetoli footprints in Tanzania, where creatures that were around the same year as Australopithecus, we have tracks in volcanic ash which have been preserved over time. What's amazing about these tracks is, first of all, they're there, because what they provide is hard evidence of habitual bipedalism. Because it's hard to tell from bones and just the foot structure that a creature might have been walking around or not, or where they were walking around. But with these footprints, you can see that the big toe is aligned and that they're pushing off with it and they're walking in a bipedal pattern. Looks like two different sized individuals, maybe parent and child or something like that. But you can see the bipedalism preserved in the tracks. The other great thing about this is because we have some time clock evidence on volcanic eruptions, we know about when these tracks would have been made. So it's a good dating period as well. So we get to this point where we have the Australopithecines, where we can securely say that we have bipedal primates. We don't have much difference in terms of brain size or we have other anatomical modifications, but we do have, by the time of 3.5 million years ago, we have very good evidence of primates that are walking around. From there, we get into, again, some debate about whether the Australopithecines split into a number of different species, or if they are simply variations on the same species. These creatures were once known as, also known as the robust Australopithecines. So there were the smaller, more delicate Australopithecines and the robust, larger Australopithecines. These are now known as Paranthropus. They had a pretty good run from about 2.77 million years ago up into 1 million years ago. So about 1.7 million years, which is pretty evolutionarily successful. We'll see if human beings can make it for 1.7 million years. We get very excited about ourselves, but honestly, we have not had a very long evolutionary run. These creatures seem to have been very well adapted to their food sources in the forest, and as the environment changed, then they eventually died out. So we often hear about survival of the fittest, but a lot of times in evolution, what you get is extinction of the fittest. Because if you were so fit that you were completely adapted to one environment, environments are always changing. What we seem to have here is these creatures going away or dying out as their environment changed. They had a good run, and we often look at evolution and we only look at what happens in the present, but we don't consider all the creatures that were pretty successful in the past because we want to know who made it into the present. We'll see if we make it for 1.7 million years.